Tonight, we journey back 70,000 years to witness the birth of humanity's most elegant weapon. Not born of rage or desperation, but of patience and the quiet genius that sleeps in human hands. This is the story of the bow and arrow, but it is also the story of how we learn to bend nature itself to our will. How we discovered that sometimes the most powerful force is not the one that crashes like thunder, but the one that whispers through the air like a prayer made manifest. In the darkness of prehistory, when our ancestors huddled around fires much like this one, someone, we will never know who, looked at a bent branch and saw possibility. They saw the future compressed into a single, elegant curve. They imagined death flying silently through space, carrying with it the promise of survival, the gift of distance, the power to strike without being struck. This is not a story of violence, though violence dwells within it. This is a story of transformation, of how a simple idea became the thread that would weave itself through every tapestry of human civilization, from the painted caves of our earliest ancestors to the siege walls of medieval castles, from the hunting grounds of nomadic tribes to the battlefields where empires rose and fell. So let the fire burn low, let the world outside fade into whispers, and listen to the song that changed everything. The song of the string, the flight of the arrow, the quiet revolution that taught humanity how to reach beyond its grasp. Imagine, if you will, a world without edges, without the sharp lines that divide our modern existence into neat categories of space and time. 70,000 years ago, the Earth was a vast, breathing organism of grass and stone and endless sky, where the only boundaries were those written in wind patterns and animal migrations, and the ancient rhythm of seasons that seemed to stretch on forever. Our ancestors were nomads in the truest sense, not by romantic choice, but by the cruel mathematics of survival. They followed the great herds, rivers of flesh and fur that flowed across continents like living tides. Mammoth and aurochs, caribou and bison, creatures so numerous that their footsteps drummed thunder into the earth, and their breath rose like morning mist across the endless plains. These early humans carried everything they owned, fire contained in carefully tended coals, wrapped in moss and sealed in hollow gourds like captured pieces of the sun. Tools knapped from stone with infinite patience, each flake removed with the precision of a prayer, spears, long, straight shafts of wood, tipped with points that had been shaped by countless hours of careful work, each one a masterpiece of deadly simplicity. And they carried stories. Stories that held the accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations, passed from mouth to mouth around fires that connected them to an unbroken chain, stretching back to the first human who ever looked up at stars and wondered. Stories of how to read the sky's moods, how to follow wounded prey through trackless wilderness, how to find water in drought and shelter in storm, how to survive another day in a world that was always, eternally, trying to kill you. But there was something missing from their arsenal, something that would seem so obvious to us now yet remained hidden in the shadows of uninvention for millennia upon millennia: the ability to kill from a distance, the power to strike without approaching, the gift of death that flies through air like a bird, carrying intention across space. Picture the frustration that must have haunted them. You crouch behind a boulder in the pale light of dawn, watching a herd of deer grazing just beyond the reach of your spear. 30 feet away, close enough to see the steam rising from their breath, close enough to count the points on their antlers, close enough to smell their wild musk on the morning wind. But 30 feet might as well be 30 miles when your longest weapon can only reach as far as your arm can thrust. The deer know this geometry of death as well as you do. They've learned, through countless generations of their own, to fear the scent of human skin, the glint of knapped stone, the almost silent whisper of approaching feet. They graze at the edge of spear, range like dancers at the edge of a cliff, never quite close enough, never quite safe enough, locked in an eternal choreography of hunger and fear. So our ancestors waited. They became masters of patience, sculptors of time itself. They dug pits and lined them with sharpened stakes, then covered them with branches woven so carefully that even the wisest old buck would step confidently to his death. They drove herds toward cliff faces, using fire and noise and the landscape itself as weapons. They learned to become the earth, to move like wind, to strike like lightning. But always, they had to get close. And in the quiet moments, when the hunt was finished and the fire burned low, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, did they ever wonder? Did they look up at those arrows of light that sometimes streaked across the darkness and dream of sending their own projectiles flying through space? Did they watch birds in flight and envy their ability to cover distance without effort? Did they see the way tree branches bent and snapped back and file that observation away in some deep corner of consciousness, waiting for the moment when need and knowledge would finally collide? We can only imagine their dreams. But we know this. Somewhere in the vast continent of Africa, in caves that still guard their secrets like sleeping dragons, the first spark of an idea was beginning to glow. An idea so simple it seems inevitable, yet so revolutionary that it would reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization. The idea that energy could be stored, that wood could be bent and convinced to remember its tension, that a string could hold power like a coiled spring and release it in a single explosive moment of purpose. The idea of the bow. There is a place in South Africa called Sibudu, a name that whispers ancient secrets in the clicking tongue of peoples whose roots stretch back to the very dawn of human consciousness. Sibudu means the place of stones, and if those stones could speak, they would tell stories that would make the very earth weep with wonder at what humans can accomplish when necessity becomes the mother of not just invention, but revolution. Sibudu Cave perches on a cliff face above the Utongathi River like a great eye watching the water flow toward the sea. For over 100,000 years, humans have sought shelter in this sacred hollow, generation upon generation building their fires in this same consecrated space. Each group left behind the detritus of their lives, layers of ash and bone, broken tools and food scraps, the accumulated archaeology of survival that built up over millennia like sedimentary stone made from human dreams and human struggles. But it was in the layers dating back 70,000 years that archaeologists discovered something that would rewrite our understanding of human ingenuity. Something so small it could be held in the palm of a hand, yet so significant it represented a leap forward in human capability that rivals the discovery of fire itself. Arrowheads. Not crude. Heavy points hammered roughly from stone, but delicate works of art that would challenge modern craftsmen. Each one had been knapped with such precision that every edge curved exactly where it needed to curve, every point tapered to mathematical perfection. These were not the desperate improvisations of starving primitives, but the careful creations of minds that understood something profound about the marriage of form and function. But here's what makes them truly extraordinary. These weren't spear points. They were too small, too light, too carefully balanced. They were designed not to be thrust by hand, but to fly through air. They were made to be shot. Someone, 70,000 years ago, had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued human hunters since the species began. Someone had figured out how to kill from a distance. The first archer remains nameless and faceless, lost in the mists of deep time, but we can imagine them. Perhaps a young hunter frustrated by too many failed stalks, or an elder whose throwing arm had begun to weaken with age, or simply someone whose mind worked differently, someone who saw possibility where others saw only limitation. Perhaps they were sitting by the fire one evening, absently bending a green branch between their hands, feeling it flex and resist. Perhaps they noticed how it wanted to spring back to its original shape when released, how it stored energy in its fibers like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Perhaps they tied a sinew from yesterday's kill between the two ends of the branch and plucked it, listening to the deep thrumming note it produced, the first song ever sung by a bowstring. Or maybe the inspiration came from watching children play with small spears, trying to see who could throw them farthest. Maybe our unnamed inventor noticed that the lightest spears flew farthest and began to wonder, what if we could make them even lighter? What if we didn't have to depend on arm strength alone? What if we could borrow power from the wood itself? However it happened, the moment of realization must have been electric. The sudden understanding that a bent stick could store energy, that a string could hold tension, that this tension could be transferred to a small projectile and send it flying farther and faster than any human arm could throw it. This was a conceptual breakthrough that required not just manual dexterity, but abstract thinking of the highest order. The first bow was probably crude, a simple arc of green wood with a string of twisted plant fiber or animal sinew. The first arrows were likely just sharpened sticks, perhaps with their points hardened in fire. But even in this primitive form, the weapon represented a revolution in human capability that would ripple through history like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Because with the bow came something more than just a new hunting tool. It came a new relationship between human and environment, hunter and prey, intention and result. For the first time in human history, we could strike at a distance. We could remain hidden while our will manifested itself in the world. We could send our intention flying through space, like a prayer made physical, carrying death or food or safety across the gulf that had always separated want from having. The bow taught us that we could bend the world to our purposes not through brute force alone, but through understanding, through seeing the hidden potential in simple materials and coaxing that potential into manifestation, through patience and practice, and the slow accumulation of skill that transforms fumbling attempts into fluid mastery. And once the first arrow flew true to its target, once the first distant kill proved that this strange new weapon actually worked, the secret began to spread, from cave to cave, tribe to tribe, carried by trade and warfare, and the simple human hunger to possess whatever advantage might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Within a few thousand years, a mere blink of an eye in the vast timeline of human existence, bow technology had spread across Africa like wildfire. Each group that encountered it added their own innovations, their own improvements, their own understanding of how to make this miracle of physics work even better. Some discovered that certain woods worked better than others, that yew was superior to oak, that bamboo could be split and laminated to create bows of incredible power. Others learned that the string mattered as much as the stave, that sinew from different animals produced different results, that the way the string was twisted and treated could mean the difference between a bow that lasted years and one that snapped on the third shot. And slowly, patiently, through trial and error and countless small discoveries, the bow evolved from a simple bent stick into something approaching the elegant weapon we recognize today, a weapon that would eventually spread to every corner of the inhabited world, that would shape the course of human civilization in ways its inventors could never have imagined. But all of that lay in the future. For now, in the caves of Cebudu, the revolution was just beginning. The first archer was drawing back the first bowstring, feeling the wood bend and store its potential energy, aiming at a target that had always been just out of reach. And when they released that string, when the first arrow flew singing through the air to strike home with deadly precision, they changed everything. They gave humanity wings. They taught us how to make our will manifest at a distance. They showed us that the impossible was just another problem waiting for the right solution. The age of the archer had begun. There is something almost mystical about the physics of a bow, something that transforms simple materials into a complex system of stored energy and precise release. When our ancestors first bent wood into that elegant curve, they were not just making a tool. They were collaborating with forces that govern the fundamental behavior of matter itself. Consider the miracle of it, a piece of wood cut from a living tree, carved and shaped until it becomes something that can store the strength of human muscle and release it in a concentrated burst of power. The bow is essentially a spring, but a spring made of organic material that remembers its original shape and fights to return to it. When you draw back the string, you are forcing the wood into an unnatural configuration, storing potential energy in its fibers like water filling a reservoir. This stored energy wants to escape. The wood yearns to spring back to its resting position. The only thing preventing this release is the archer's grip on the string, human while holding natural force in check, waiting for the precise moment when control becomes liberation. And when that moment comes, when the fingers open and the string snaps forward, physics takes over. The stored energy in the bent wood transfers to the string, which transfers it to the arrow, accelerating the projectile from 0 to over 100 miles per hour in a fraction of a second. The arrow carries this energy with it as it flies, a small messenger bearing the concentrated intention of its archer across space and time. But creating this system required our ancestors to understand principles that wouldn't be formally described by science for thousands of years. They had to grasp intuitively that different woods have different elastic properties, that some materials store energy more efficiently than others. They had to learn through experimentation that the thickness of the bow stave affected not just its power, but its durability. That too thin would break under stress, while too thick would be sluggish and inefficient. The string presented its own challenges. Plant fibers could be woven together to create strong cord, but they stretched and weakened when wet. Animal sinews were stronger and more consistent, but had to be carefully prepared and twisted to achieve the right balance of strength and flexibility. The connection between string and stave had to be absolutely secure. There's no margin for error when you're dealing with forces that can drive an arrow through an animal's ribs. And then there was the arrow itself, a marvel of engineering that required its own set of discoveries. Length mattered. Too short and the arrow would lack stability in flight. Too long and it would be unwieldy and prone to wobbling. Weight distribution was crucial. The balance point had to be just forward of center for proper flight characteristics. The knot, where the arrow sits on the string, had to be carved with precision to ensure clean release. Most critically, our ancestors had to discover fletching, the art of attaching feathers to the rear of the arrow to stabilize its flight. Without fletching, arrows tumble and veer unpredictably through the air. With proper fletching, they fly straight and true, spinning slightly as they travel in a way that keeps them on course, like the rifling in a gun barrel. They learned all of this through patient observation and countless failed attempts. They learned that feathers from the same wing of a bird work better than mixed feathers, that the angle of attachment affects the arrow's spin, that even the type of glue used to secure the fletching can influence performance. Each discovery built upon the last, creating an accumulated body of knowledge that transformed crude projectiles into precision instruments. The arrowhead itself required metallurgical understanding that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. Working with stone tools, ancient craftsmen learned to knap flint and obsidian and other materials into points so sharp they could split hairs. They understood that the shape of the point affected both penetration and the wound it would create, that barbed points were harder to remove, but also harder to manufacture, that the hafting, the way the point was attached to the shaft, had to be absolutely reliable. They developed adhesives that could withstand impact and weather, mixing tree resins with ash and other materials to create glues that held under stress. They learned to wrap the hafting area with sinew or cord in patterns that distributed stress and prevented the shaft from splitting. They discovered that heating the shaft slightly before inserting the point made for a tighter fit that would last longer. All of this knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from master to apprentice in the time-honored way of craft traditions. A young archer would spend years learning not just how to shoot, but how to make and maintain their equipment. They learned to select the right wood by examining the grain, to test the moisture content by feel, to judge the quality of sinew by its color and texture. They learned the patience required to season wood properly. Too green and it would warp and crack, too old and it would become brittle. They learned to work with the natural properties of materials rather than against them, to see the bow that wanted to emerge from a particular stave rather than forcing an inappropriate design upon unwilling wood. And gradually, through this accumulation of knowledge and skill, the bow evolved from a simple bent stick into something approaching technological sophistication. Different cultures developed different styles based on available materials and hunting needs. Some created recurved bows, where the tips curved forward to store more energy in a shorter frame. Others developed composite bows that layered different materials to optimize performance. Sinew on the back for tension, wood in the core for structure, horn on the belly for compression. Each innovation built upon the fundamental insight that had emerged from those first experiments in Sibudu Cave, that human intelligence could partner with natural forces to extend human capability far beyond its biological limits. The bow was proof that we didn't have to accept the constraints of our physical form, that through understanding and ingenuity we could transcend our limitations and achieve the seemingly impossible. When an archer draws back their bow and releases an arrow that flies true to its target, they are participating in a conversation that began 70,000 years ago. They are adding their voice to a dialogue between human will and natural law that has continued unbroken across every generation since that first unknown inventor bent their first stick and heard the first song of string and wood. Picture the world as it was 50,000 years ago, a vast network of human communities scattered across Africa like stars in a dark sky, each one a small point of light in an ocean of wilderness. These communities were connected not by roads or written messages, but by something more elemental: the ancient pathways of human movement, the trade routes and migration paths that followed rivers and mountain passes and seasonal hunting grounds. And along these pathways, like seeds carried on the wind, travelled ideas. The knowledge of fire making, the techniques of stone knapping, the stories that held cultural memory, and slowly but inevitably, the revolutionary technology of the bow and arrow. It began with a single successful hunt. Imagine a group of traders arriving at a distant camp, carrying with them not just goods for exchange, but stories of a miraculous new weapon they had witnessed. They spoke in hushed, excited voices around the fire, describing arrows that flew farther than any spear could be thrown, that struck with deadly precision from impossible distances. At first, the listeners might have been skeptical. Every hunter has heard tales that grow larger with each telling, but these traders carried proof. The small, delicate arrowheads so different from the heavy points used on thrusting spears. They spoke with the authority of witnesses, describing not just what they had heard, but what they had seen with their own eyes, and so the first seeds of change were planted. Within days, the most innovative hunters in the camp were experimenting, trying to recreate this miraculous weapon from fragments of description and samples of arrows. Most early attempts probably failed. The physics of the bow are not immediately obvious, and mastering the craft requires not just understanding but patient practice. But humans are persistent learners, and the advantages of ranged warfare were too obvious to ignore. Eventually, through trial and error, and the gradual accumulation of small discoveries, someone would succeed in creating a functional bow. And once they had succeeded, once they had proven that the stories were true, the knowledge would spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. This process repeated itself across Africa over thousands of years. Each successful adoption led to further refinement and innovation. Different communities developed different solutions to common problems, creating a rich diversity of bow designs and arrow types. Some cultures specialized in small, precise bows perfect for hunting birds and small game. Others developed powerful weapons capable of bringing down large animals. The technology wasn't just copied, it was adapted, improved, localized. Communities that lived in forests developed short, maneuverable bows that could be used effectively in thick vegetation. Those who hunted on open plains created longer, more powerful weapons capable of extreme range and penetration. Each environment demanded its own solutions, and human ingenuity rose to meet those demands. By around 15,000 years ago, this process of cultural diffusion had carried bow technology to every inhabited continent except Australia, where the atlatl, the spear thrower, remained the preferred ranged weapon. The speed of this spread is remarkable when you consider that it occurred entirely through human, to human contact without any form of mass communication or organized dissemination. But the spread of the bow was more than just the movement of technology. It was the propagation of a new way of thinking about human capability. Each community that adopted the bow had to grapple with its implications, had to reorganize their hunting strategies and social structures around this new capability. Suddenly, a single skilled archer could bring down game that had previously required coordinated group efforts. Hunting parties could be smaller and more mobile. Prey animals that had learned to avoid humans at spear range were suddenly vulnerable to attacks from previously safe distances. The fundamental balance between hunter and hunted had shifted, and human communities found themselves with new opportunities and new challenges. The social implications were profound. Archery required different skills than spear hunting, less physical strength but more fine motor control, less raw aggression but more patience and precision. This opened up hunting roles to individuals who might not have been suited to close quarters combat with dangerous prey. The elderly, whose accumulated wisdom was valuable but whose physical strength was declining, could remain productive hunters long after they could no longer wield heavy spears effectively. Women, typically excluded from the most dangerous hunting activities, found that archery offered opportunities for participation that had been closed to them before. The bow was a great equalizer in many ways, making success dependent more on skill and practice than on brute physical capability. This democratization of hunting had ripple effects throughout early human societies. Communities with more skilled archers could support larger populations, could venture into territories that had been too dangerous to exploit effectively, could accumulate surpluses that led to the development of more complex social structures. The bow also changed the nature of human conflict. Warfare, when it occurred between competing groups, was no longer just a matter of close quarters combat with clubs and spears. Archers could strike from ambush, could defend positions that would have been impossible to hold with melee weapons alone. The tactical implications were enormous and would continue to evolve over thousands of years. But perhaps most importantly, the bow represented proof of concept for human technological development. It demonstrated that careful observation, patient experimentation, and gradual refinement could produce tools that dramatically extended human capability. It showed that we were not limited to using the world as we found it, but could reshape it to serve our purposes. This lesson would be applied again and again throughout human history. The same patient, methodical approach that produced the bow would eventually give us agriculture, metallurgy, architecture, and all the other technologies that separate human civilization from the natural world. The bow was perhaps the first clear example of human engineering, the conscious design and construction of a device that performed better than anything nature had provided. And as the technology spread from community to community across the ancient world, it carried with it not just the knowledge of how to make and use bows and arrows, but the more fundamental understanding that human intelligence could be applied systematically to solve problems and extend capabilities. It planted the seeds of the technological mindset that would eventually reshape the entire planet. In caves and shelters across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, people began to look at the world around them with new eyes. Wood could be bent to store energy, if strings could transfer that energy to projectiles, if arrows could be made to fly straight and true. What other possibilities lay hidden in the materials and forces of the natural world, waiting for human ingenuity to discover and harness them? The age of technology had begun, and it started with a simple curve of wood and a taut string singing its ancient song of human potential realized. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the ancient world held its breath between night and day, two hunters prepared for the morning's work. One carried a bow, its curved wood dark with oil and age, a quiver of arrows fletched with careful precision. The other held an atlatl, a flat, narrow stick with a cup at one end, designed to extend the reach of the human arm and multiply its throwing power. Both weapons could kill at distance. Both represented sophisticated solutions to the fundamental problem of hunting. but they were different solutions, emerging from different ways of understanding the relationship between human capability and natural law. And for thousands of years, they existed side by side, competing for dominance in a slow, motion evolutionary struggle that would help determine the future of human technology. The atlatl was, in many ways, the more intuitive invention. Any human who had ever thrown a stick could understand its basic principle. It was simply an extension of the arm, a way of adding leverage to increase the speed and distance of a thrown projectile. The physics were obvious. A longer lever meant more power, more range, more impact. The weapon emerged around 20,000 years ago, possibly earlier, and spread rapidly across the inhabited world. Like the bow, it represented a breakthrough in ranged warfare, allowing hunters to kill from distances that had been impossible with handheld weapons. But unlike the bow, the atlatl was relatively easy to master. A novice could learn basic proficiency in weeks or months, while archery required years of patient practice to achieve real skill. This difference in learning curve had profound implications. Communities could train atlatl hunters quickly, could respond rapidly to opportunities or threats that required ranged combat capability. An inexperienced hunter could be given an atlatl and darts and sent out with reasonable hope of success within a matter of days. The projectiles used with atlatls were more substantial than arrows, heavier, more robust, capable of delivering tremendous impact energy. While an arrow might wound and rely on bleeding to bring down prey, an atlatl dart could deliver a killing blow through sheer kinetic energy. For hunting large, dangerous animals, this made the atlatl an extremely attractive option. The weapon excelled particularly in hunting megafauna, the giant animals that populated the Pleistocene world. Mammoth giant ground sloths, cave bears, and other massive creatures required weapons that could penetrate thick hide and deliver enough trauma to bring down enormous bodies. The heavy darts thrown by skilled atlatl users could punch through armor, like skin, and break bones, making them ideal for this type of hunting. But the bow offered different advantages. While it required more skill to master, it also offered greater precision and rate of fire. An experienced archer could loose arrow after arrow in rapid succession. While atlatl use was necessarily slower, each dart had to be carefully positioned and thrown individually. The bow was also more portable, requiring less movement to aim and fire, making it better suited for hunting in thick cover where sudden opportunities might present themselves. The arrows used with bows were lighter and more numerous than atlatl darts, allowing hunters to carry more ammunition for extended hunts. This was particularly valuable for pursuit hunting, where prey might be wounded and followed for miles before finally succumbing. An archer could afford to take multiple shots, could wound an animal, and continue pursuing it with additional arrows, while an atlatl hunter had to make each heavy dart count. There were also social and cultural factors that influenced the adoption of one weapon over the other. The atlatl, being easier to learn, was more democratic in its accessibility. Any member of a community could be trained to basic competency relatively quickly. The bow, requiring years of practice to master, tended to create specialists, individuals whose skill with the weapon set them apart from their peers. This specialization could be either an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on the social structure of a particular community. Societies that valued individual expertise and were willing to support specialists could benefit enormously from having master archers. Communities that preferred more egalitarian structures might find the bow's requirement for specialized training disruptive to their social organization. The two weapons coexisted for thousands of years, with different communities choosing different paths based on their particular needs and circumstances. In some regions, the atlatl remained dominant well into historical times. The Aztecs used atlals as primary weapons alongside obsidian-edged clubs, finding that the weapon's ability to deliver heavy darts at high speed was well suited to their style of warfare and the materials available in Mesoamerica. In Australia, the atlatl became so thoroughly integrated into Aboriginal culture that bow technology, though it certainly reached the continent through contact with other peoples, never gained widespread adoption. The traditional hunting methods that had evolved around the spear thrower were so effective and so deeply embedded in cultural practices that there was little pressure to adopt alternative technologies. But in most of the world, the bow gradually gained ascendancy. The reasons were complex and varied by region, but several factors seem to have tipped the balance. The bow's greater precision made it more effective for hunting smaller game, and as megafauna began to disappear from many regions, due to climate change and possibly overhunting, this advantage became more important. The weapon's portability and quick deployment also made it better suited to the changing conditions of the post-glacial world. As forests expanded and open grasslands contracted, hunting often required moving through thick vegetation, where the atlatl's throwing motion was impractical. The bow could be drawn and released in confined spaces, making it more versatile in varied environments. Perhaps most importantly, the bow proved more adaptable to military applications. While both weapons could be used in warfare, the bow's rapid rate of fire and precision made it more effective in the kind of organized combat that became increasingly important as human populations grew and conflicts became larger and more complex. The transition was gradual and varied by region. In many areas, both weapons continued to be used side by side, with different tools chosen for different purposes. Some hunters carried both, using atlatls for large game and bows for smaller prey. Others specialized in one weapon or the other based on personal preference and local conditions. But slowly, across most of the inhabited world, the bow began to predominate. Atlatl technology didn't disappear entirely. It was incorporated into larger weapon systems, evolving into catapults and ballistas and other siege engines. But as a personal weapon, it gradually gave way to the more versatile and ultimately more powerful technology of the bow. This transition marked a crucial moment in human technological development. It demonstrated that superior technology doesn't always win immediately, that factors like ease of use, cultural fit, and social organization can influence which innovations are adopted and which are abandoned. It showed that technological evolution is not simply a matter of finding the best solution, but of finding solutions that work well within particular contexts and constraints. The eventual dominance of the bow also established patterns that would repeat throughout human history. The weapon that required the most skill to master ultimately proved most successful, suggesting that societies willing to invest in specialized training and complex technologies would have advantages over those that preferred simpler, more immediately accessible solutions. In the end, both the bow and the atlatl served the same fundamental purpose. They extended human reach and striking power beyond the limitations of unaugmented biology. Both represented triumphs of human ingenuity over natural constraints, but they did so in different ways, and those differences had consequences that rippled through thousands of years of human development. The choice between them was never just about weapons. It was about different approaches to solving problems, different values regarding individual versus collective capability, different visions of how technology should interact with human society. In choosing the bow, our ancestors chose a path that valued precision over power, skill over simplicity, specialized excellence over general competency. That choice shaped not just how we hunt, but how we think about the relationship between human potential and technological achievement. It established patterns of technological development that continue to influence us today, as we continue to face choices between simpler, more accessible solutions and complex, powerful tools that require significant investment to master. The song of the bowstring had won, but it was a victory that taught us something important about the nature of progress itself. There is blood in the history of every human invention, and the bow carries more than most. What began as a tool for feeding families became, inevitably and perhaps tragically, an instrument of war. The same precision that could bring down a deer could just as easily pierce the heart of an enemy. The same skill that had been developed to ensure survival became a means of ensuring that others would not survive. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it universal. For thousands of years, The bow remained primarily a hunting weapon, used occasionally in conflicts between groups, but not yet organized into the systematic application of violence that we call warfare. But as human populations grew, as resources became scarcer, as territories became defined and defended, the military potential of archery could no longer be ignored. The first military archers were probably hunters pressed into service during conflicts, bringing their personal weapons to defend their communities. They would have been individual specialists rather than organized units, valued for their particular skills but not yet integrated into larger tactical systems. A skilled archer might be positioned to pick off enemy leaders or harass attackers, but they were not yet the massed formations that would later dominate ancient battlefields. But military leaders quickly recognized the potential of organized archery. A group of archers working together could deliver far more devastating firepower than the sum of their individual capabilities. Concentrated volleys of arrows could break up enemy formations before they reached melee range, could disrupt cavalry charges, could defend walls and narrow passes against vastly superior numbers. The Egyptians were among the first to fully exploit this potential. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, Egyptian armies included substantial numbers of professional archers, equipped with powerful composite bows and trained in coordinated tactics. These were not farmer hunters called up for occasional service, but career soldiers who devoted their lives to mastering the art of war. Egyptian archery tactics were sophisticated and varied. Light archers would skirmish ahead of the main force, harassing enemy formations and trying to provoke premature charges. Heavy archers, protected by shields and positioned in organized ranks, would deliver massed volleys at crucial moments in battle. Mobile archers on chariots could strike at enemy flanks and retreat before effective response was possible. The composite bows used by these professional soldiers were marvels of ancient engineering, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew. They were far more powerful than simple wooden bows and could drive arrows through armor at considerable distances. The manufacturing process required specialized craftsmen and expensive materials, making these weapons symbols of wealth and power as much as instruments of war. The Assyrians took military archery even further, developing tactics and equipment that would influence warfare for centuries. Assyrian archers were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill and effectiveness. They used a variety of specialized arrows for different purposes: bokken points for penetrating armor, broadheads for maximum tissue damage, fire arrows for sieges, and even arrows designed to make specific sounds in flight to communicate with other units. Assyrian siege warfare relied heavily on archery. Archers would provide covering fire for siege engines, suppress defenders on walls, and maintain constant pressure throughout lengthy sieges. The Assyrians developed mobile shields and protective screens that allowed their archers to work effectively even under counter fire, and they were among the first to use archery in systematic psychological warfare, raining arrows on besieged cities not just to kill defenders, but to terrorize civilian populations and break their will to resist. The sound of thousands of arrows whistling through the air, the sight of the sky darkening with incoming projectiles, the constant threat of death from an invisible enemy, these became weapons of the mind as much as the body. The Assyrians understood that fear could be as effective as physical destruction in achieving military objectives, but it was the Greeks who first demonstrated archery's potential in large-scale warfare between organized states. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, Persian archers formed a crucial part of the invasion force that seemed poised to overwhelm the Greek city-states. The Persians had learned from earlier conflicts that their composite bows gave them significant advantages over Greek forces that relied primarily on heavy infantry armed with spears and shields. The Persian military machine included thousands of archers drawn from across their vast empire. Scythian horse archers, renowned for their mobility and marksmanship, median foot archers with powerful composite bows, specialized units that could maintain steady volleys of arrows for hours at a time. The sight of this massed archery force had broken the morale of countless enemies before the battle even began. Yet the Greeks found ways to neutralize this advantage. They used terrain to limit the effectiveness of archery, forcing close quarters combat where their superior armor and training in melee warfare could dominate. They developed tactical formations that could advance under arrow fire, accepting casualties but maintaining cohesion until they could close to spear range. They showed that archery, for all its power, was not invincible when faced with determined and well-trained opponents. The Romans took a different approach to military archery. Rather than developing their own archery traditions, they relied heavily on auxiliary troops drawn from cultures that had maintained strong archery traditions. Cretan archers, famous throughout the Mediterranean for their skill. Germanic tribes whose hunting traditions translated well to military applications. Balearic slingers who could achieve similar effects with different weapons. This approach reflected Roman pragmatism about military technology. They were less interested in developing the best weapons than in using whatever worked most effectively. Roman military engineering focused on logistics, organization, and the systematic application of combined arms tactics, rather than relying on any single weapon system to dominate the battlefield. Roman legions included archers as standard components, but these were typically specialist troops rather than line soldiers. They would soften up enemy formations, provide covering fire for engineering operations, and handle specific tactical situations that required ranged weapons. But the heart of Roman military power remained the heavily armored legionnaire with sword and shield, supported by a carefully organized system of supply and command. The decline of the Western Roman Empire created opportunities for cultures that had maintained strong archery traditions to reassert their importance. The Hunnic invasions under Attila demonstrated the continued effectiveness of horse archery against conventional infantry forces. The Huns used tactics that had been perfected on the Asian steppes: rapid advances, concentrated arrow fire, feigned retreats that drew enemies into ambushes. These steppe tactics relied on mobility and the psychological impact of facing an enemy that could strike from any direction without warning. Hunnic armies could appear as if from nowhere, rain arrows on their opponents, and disappear before effective retaliation was possible. They showed that archery combined with superior mobility could overcome enemies with better armor and more sophisticated siege equipment. But it was in medieval Europe that archery reached perhaps its most famous and influential development. The English longbow emerged from centuries of Welsh archery traditions, refined and systematized into a weapon system that would dominate European battlefields for over 2 centuries. The longbow was not necessarily superior to other bow designs in terms of raw power or accuracy. What made it special was the way it was integrated into English military culture and tactics. English archers trained from childhood, developing the enormous physical strength required to draw bows that pulled over 100 pounds. They practiced constantly, honing their skills through competitions and hunting, as well as formal military training. This created a class of professional archers whose skill levels were unprecedented in European warfare. An English longbowman could loose 12 arrows per minute, with deadly accuracy at ranges exceeding 200 yards. A formation of several thousand such archers could create what contemporary accounts described as storms of arrows that blotted out the sun. The tactical implications were revolutionary. At Crécy in 1346, English archers virtually annihilated a French army that outnumbered them by more than 2 to 1. The flower of French chivalry, heavily armored knights who represented the military elite of their age, were cut down by arrows fired by men they considered social inferiors. The battle marked the beginning of the end for heavy cavalry as the dominant force in European warfare. Agincourt in 1415 provided an even more dramatic demonstration of longbow effectiveness. Henry V's army, weakened by disease and vastly outnumbered, used terrain and archery to achieve one of the most lopsided victories in military history. French knights, trapped in muddy fields and unable to maneuver effectively, were systematically destroyed by arrow fire that penetrated even the finest armor of the period. These victories had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. They demonstrated that superior technology and training could overcome traditional advantages of birth and social position. They showed that warfare was evolving in directions that favored organized, professional forces over the feudal levy system that had dominated medieval Europe. The social implications were profound. Archery was a skill that could be learned by anyone willing to invest the time and effort required. Unlike mounted combat, which required expensive horses and equipment available only to the wealthy, the bow was a relatively democratic weapon. This created opportunities for social mobility that had been largely absent from earlier military systems. English archers were often drawn from the yeoman class, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of rural society. Military service as an archer offered them opportunities for advancement and enrichment that would have been impossible in other occupations. Successful archers could earn substantial pay, acquire land through military service, and even achieve minor noble status through exceptional performance. This democratization of military service contributed to broader social changes throughout Europe. As rulers recognized the military advantages of professional archer units, they began to recruit more broadly from their populations, offering training and equipment to men who could meet the physical and skill requirements. This created new classes of military professionals whose loyalty was to their commanders and their units, rather than to traditional feudal obligations. The dominance of archery also drove rapid innovation in defensive technologies. Armor makers developed new techniques for creating steel plates that could deflect or stop arrows. Castle designers incorporated features specifically intended to neutralize archer attacks. Military engineers developed new approaches to siege warfare that took account of the threat posed by massed archery. But perhaps most importantly, the success of archery in medieval warfare established patterns of technological competition that would characterize European military development for centuries. The constant pressure to develop better offensive weapons and more effective defensive countermeasures created an environment of continuous innovation that would eventually lead to the development of firearms and the military revolution of the early modern period. The bow had become more than just a weapon. It was a catalyst for broader changes in how societies organized themselves for war and how they thought about the relationship between technology and military effectiveness. It had shown that superior skill and organization could overcome traditional advantages, that innovation could upset established power relationships, and that the future belonged to those who could most effectively harness new technologies to achieve their objectives. And in proving all of this, archery had also sealed its own fate. The same pressures that had driven the development of increasingly powerful bows and more effective arrows were already working to produce weapons that would eventually make archery obsolete on the battlefield. The age of gunpowder was approaching, and with it would come new ways of thinking about warfare, technology, and the projection of power across distance. But that transformation lay still in the future. For now, in the high medieval period, the bow reigned supreme, its string song echoing across battlefields from England to Japan, its arrows carrying not just death, but the promise of change, the whisper of a world in transition between one age and another. There is a hidden arithmetic in every war, a cold mathematics of resources and production that determines victory as surely as courage or strategy. When medieval armies marched to battle with their ranks of archers, they carried with them not just weapons, but the accumulated wealth of entire kingdoms converted into instruments of death. Behind every arrow loosed in anger lay months of labor, skilled craftsmanship, and the complex economic relationships that could sustain organized violence on a massive scale. Consider the true cost of a single arrow in the hands of an English longbowman at Agincourt. The shaft, carefully selected from straight, grained ash or birch, represented hours of searching through forests to find wood with exactly the right properties. The craftsman who shaped it, the fletcher, had spent years learning his trade, developing the eye and hand skills necessary to create projectiles that would fly true over hundreds of yards. The point, forged from iron or steel, required the services of a blacksmith with specialized knowledge of metallurgy. The metal itself had to be mined, smelted, and refined through processes that consumed enormous amounts of fuel and labor. The tempering that gave the point its hardness and durability was an art form in itself, requiring precise control of temperature and timing that took years to master. The fletching, usually goose feathers, carefully selected for uniformity and properly cured, represented another specialized trade. Professional fletchers maintained relationships with suppliers who could provide feathers of consistent quality, and the process of splitting, trimming, and attaching them to the shaft required tools and techniques that had been refined over generations. The glue that held everything together was often made from fish bones or animal hides, requiring yet another set of specialized knowledge and equipment. Even the silk or sinew used to bind the fletching represented significant economic value. Silk especially was a luxury import that connected local military production to international trade networks stretching across continents. Multiply this single arrow by the thousands needed to equip an army, and the scale of economic organization becomes staggering. A typical English archer might carry 60 arrows into battle, with additional supplies held in reserve. An army of 5,000 archers therefore required 300,000 arrows for their initial equipment alone, plus ongoing resupply as arrows were lost, broken, or expended in combat. This level of production required what amounted to an early form of industrial organization. Skilled craftsmen had to be identified, trained, and supported. Raw materials had to be sourced from across the kingdom and beyond. Quality control systems had to be established to ensure that arrows produced by different workshops would perform consistently. Transportation networks had to be developed to move finished products from production centers to military depots, and ultimately to armies in the field. The bow itself represented an even more complex production challenge. English longbows were typically made from yew wood, but not just any yew would suffice. The best bows required staves cut from trees that had grown slowly in mountainous regions, developing the tight, even grain that provided optimal strength and flexibility. Much of this wood came from the Alps, requiring international trade relationships and significant capital investment. A master bower might spend weeks shaping a single bow, carefully working the wood to achieve the precise taper and curve that would produce maximum power and accuracy. The process could not be rushed. The wood had to be seasoned properly, shaped gradually to avoid splitting, and finished with multiple coats of oil or varnish that required time to cure between applications. The economic value of a finished longbow was enormous by medieval standards. A skilled craftsman might earn more for a single high-quality bow than a common labourer could make in months of work. The bow represented not just the immediate labour of its creation, but years of training and accumulated expertise that commanded premium prices. Yet even these individual costs pale beside the expense of training and maintaining archer units. Contemporary sources suggest that it took approximately 5 years for a man to develop sufficient skill with the longbow to be effective in military service. During this period, he had to be fed, equipped, and compensated for his time. Costs that had to be borne by someone, whether the individual archer himself, his community, or the royal treasury. The physical demands of longbow archery meant that archers had to maintain their training continuously. A man who stopped practicing for even a few months would lose much of his strength and accuracy. This created ongoing costs for practice arrows, targets, and the time lost from other productive activities. Communities that maintained archer units were essentially supporting a class of military specialists who contributed little to normal economic production. The English solution to this problem was to integrate archery training into rural life through hunting and sport. Laws required regular practice with the bow and prohibited other games that might distract young men from developing their archery skills. This distributed the costs of training across society while creating a pool of skilled archers who could be called up for military service when needed. But even this system required significant royal investment. The crown had to maintain stocks of bows and arrows for issue to troops, establish workshops for military production, and create supply systems that could support armies in the field. During major campaigns, the English government might spend more on archery equipment than on all other military expenses combined. The strategic implications of these costs were profound. Only wealthy, organized states could afford to maintain large numbers of skilled archers. This gave significant military advantages to kingdoms that could marshal the economic resources necessary for sustained archery-based warfare, while putting smaller or poorer states at severe disadvantages. The French learned this lesson painfully during the 100 Years' War. Despite having larger populations and more territory than England, they struggled to develop effective counter-strategies to English archery, partly because they lacked the economic systems necessary to support large-scale archer training and equipment production. Their attempts to recruit crossbowmen from Italian states represented recognition that archery required specialized economic infrastructure that could not be improvised quickly. This economic dimension of military archery created new forms of international relationship and dependency. States that wanted to field effective archer units but lacked domestic production capabilities had to develop trade relationships with suppliers of raw materials and finished equipment. This connected military planning to commercial networks in ways that influenced diplomatic and strategic decision-making. The Italian states became major suppliers of crossbows and bolts to armies throughout Europe, using their advanced manufacturing techniques and commercial networks to create what amounted to a military-industrial complex centuries before the term was invented. Venice and Genoa competed not just in trade goods, but in military equipment, with contracts for supplying armies becoming major sources of revenue and political influence. The Mongols took a different approach, integrating archery production into their nomadic lifestyle in ways that minimized monetary costs while maximizing military effectiveness. Mongol archers made their own equipment from materials available on the steppes, using composite bow designs that could be produced without specialized workshops or imported materials. This gave them strategic independence from supply lines that could be disrupted by enemies or allies. Mongol military organization treated every adult male as a potential archer, with training beginning in childhood and continuing throughout life as part of normal cultural practice. This eliminated the distinction between military specialists and productive civilians that created such expense for settled societies. When Mongol armies needed arrows, they could produce them from locally available materials rather than relying on distant workshops and complex supply chains. This difference in economic organization helps explain why nomadic empires like the Mongols could often achieve military success against settled civilizations with superior resources and technology. The nomads' ability to maintain military effectiveness without the complex, expensive infrastructure required by conventional armies gave them significant strategic advantages, especially in extended campaigns far from their home territories. The Chinese developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to the economics of military archery. Chinese crossbow production was organized along industrial lines centuries before similar systems appeared in Europe. Standardized parts allowed for efficient manufacturing and field repair. Quality control systems ensured consistent performance across different production facilities. Government arsenals maintained enormous stockpiles of weapons and ammunition that could support extended military campaigns. Chinese military manuals from the Tang and Song dynasties discuss archery economics in remarkable detail, calculating the costs of different arrow types, comparing the expenses of maintaining crossbow units versus cavalry, and analyzing the trade-offs between quality and quantity in equipment procurement. These documents reveal a level of systematic thinking about military economics that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several centuries. The rise of gunpowder weapons eventually disrupted these carefully developed economic systems, but not immediately and not uniformly. Early firearms were expensive and unreliable compared to bows, and the transition from archery-based to gunpowder-based armies took place over centuries rather than decades. During this transition period, the economics of military production became even more complex. Armies had to maintain both archery and firearms capabilities, requiring investment in two different sets of production systems and training programs. The costs of this duplication helped drive the eventual abandonment of archery in favor of weapons that promised greater military effectiveness per unit of economic investment. But the lessons learned during the archery era about the relationships between economic organization, technological capability, and military effectiveness continued to influence military thinking long after the last longbow was drawn in anger. The understanding that sustained military advantage required not just better weapons, but better systems for producing, maintaining, and supplying those weapons became fundamental to modern military planning. In the end, the bow and arrow taught humanity crucial lessons about the economics of organized violence. It showed that military effectiveness was not just a matter of individual courage or tactical skill, but of the ability to marshal economic resources efficiently and sustainably. It demonstrated that technological advantages could be neutralized by superior organization, and that long-term military success required thinking systematically about the relationship between economic capability and strategic objectives. These lessons would prove invaluable as human societies grew larger and more complex, as wars became more extensive and destructive, and as the tools of violence became more sophisticated and expensive. The bow had been not just a weapon, but a teacher, instructing our species in the hard arithmetic of power and the economic foundations of military might. In the quiet village of Finsbury, just north of London's ancient walls, something extraordinary was taking place every Sunday after church, while other communities across Europe were content with simple recreations. Dancing, drinking, the occasional wrestling match, the men and boys of Finsbury were engaged in what amounted to a systematic transformation of human capability. They were learning to kill at impossible distances. The targets stood at ranges that would have seemed fantastical to earlier generations of warriors. 200 yards, 250. Some of the most skilled archers could strike man-sized targets at over 300 yards, distances at which an enemy would appear as little more than a moving dot against the landscape. But distance alone was not the goal. These were not exhibition shooters seeking to impress audiences with trick shots. These were soldiers preparing for war, and their practice regimens reflected the deadly serious mathematics of battlefield effectiveness. They practiced shooting rapidly, loosing arrow after arrow in sustained volleys that could maintain devastating firepower for extended periods. They practiced shooting in formation, coordinating their fire to create concentrated barrages that could overwhelm enemy defenses. Most importantly, they practiced shooting at armored targets. The development of medieval armor had created an arms race that pushed archery technology to its absolute limits. Early arrows that could easily pierce leather or cloth were useless against the steel plates that increasingly protected European knights. Archers had to develop new arrow designs, new shooting techniques, and new tactical approaches specifically designed to defeat the best armor their enemies could afford. The bodkin point represented perhaps the most sophisticated response to this challenge. Unlike the broad hunting points that created wide wounds in unarmored targets, bodkins were narrow, needle-like projections designed to concentrate all of an arrow's kinetic energy into the smallest possible area. They couldn't cut through steel, but they could exploit the gaps between armor plates or punch through mail links when striking at precisely the right angle. Creating effective bodkin points required metallurgical knowledge that pushed medieval blacksmithing to its limits. The steel had to be hard enough to penetrate armor without breaking, yet tough enough to survive the impact forces involved. The heat treatment process required precise control of temperature and timing that took years to master. Even the smallest variations in technique could produce points that shattered on impact or bent rather than penetrating. The shafts, too, had to be engineered for maximum penetration rather than broad wound creation. They were often made slightly heavier than hunting arrows, providing more kinetic energy at the target. The The balance point was moved forward to improve accuracy at long range. The nocks were reinforced to handle the enormous forces generated by the heaviest war bows. But the most dramatic innovation was in the bows themselves. The English longbow reached its ultimate development during the 14th and 15th centuries, evolving into a weapon that modern analysts struggle to believe could have been drawn by human muscle power alone. Archaeological evidence suggests that the heaviest war bows required draw weights exceeding 150 pounds, nearly twice the strength needed for effective hunting. Drawing such a bow required not just exceptional strength, but specific muscular development that could only be achieved through years of dedicated training. The skeletal remains of medieval archers show distinctive bone modifications that reflect the enormous stresses placed on their bodies by their weapons. Enlarged attachment points where muscles connected to bones, asymmetrical development of the arms and shoulders, spinal adaptations to handle the compression forces generated during the draw. These were not weekend warriors or casual hunters, but human beings who had literally reshaped their bodies to serve their weapons. They represented a level of specialization that bordered on the superhuman, achieved through training regimens that modern athletes would find daunting. The psychological demands were as extreme as the physical ones. Combat archery required the ability to maintain precision under conditions of extreme stress, to calculate wind and distance while enemy arrows fell like rain around you, to loose arrow after arrow with mechanical consistency, even as friends died beside you. Training for this mental resilience was as systematic as the physical conditioning. Archers practiced shooting while under simulated attack, with other archers shooting blunt arrows at them or swordsmen threatening them with wooden weapons. They trained to ignore distractions, to focus entirely on the target despite chaos erupting around them. They also learned to shoot by instinct rather than conscious aiming, at the speeds required for battlefield effectiveness, up to 12 arrows per minute for sustained periods. There was no time for careful aim at individual targets. Instead, archers developed an intuitive understanding of trajectory and wind compensation that allowed them to engage targets accurately while concentrating primarily on rate of fire. This instinctive shooting required what modern sports psychologists would recognize as a flow state, a condition of complete absorption in the task that eliminated conscious thought and allowed trained reflexes to operate with perfect efficiency. Medieval training manuals describe exercises designed to induce this state, techniques for maintaining concentration under stress, and methods for developing the kind of automatic responses that could function effectively in combat. The tactical employment of these super archers reflected their extraordinary capabilities. English armies organized archer formations to maximize both their individual and collective effectiveness. The classic formation placed archers behind stakes or other obstacles that would protect them from cavalry charges, while allowing clear fields of fire. Supporting infantry protected the archers' flanks and rear, while cavalry or dismounted men at arms provided the striking power needed to exploit the disruption created by arrow fire. The psychological impact of facing massed longbow fire was as important as the physical casualties it inflicted. Contemporary accounts describe the terror of watching thousands of arrows arc through the sky toward your formation, knowing that there was nothing you could do to avoid them, that your survival depended entirely on the quality of your armor and the randomness of trajectory. The sound alone was reportedly enough to break the morale of inexperienced troops. The deep thrumming of hundreds of bowstrings releasing simultaneously, the whistle of arrows in flight, the impacts as projectiles struck armor, shields, and flesh, the screams of wounded men and horses, the sight of the sky literally darkening with incoming arrows. French chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe battles where enemy formations broke and fled before any physical contact had occurred, simply because they could not endure the psychological pressure of sustained arrow fire. Knights who had been trained from childhood to face death in close combat found themselves paralyzed by an enemy they could not reach, could not strike back at, could not even see clearly through the forest of incoming projectiles. This psychological warfare was deliberate and carefully calculated. English commanders understood that breaking enemy morale was often more effective than inflicting casualties, and they organized their archery tactics accordingly. Concentrated volleys fired at precise moments for maximum shock effect, sustained harassment to wear down enemy resolve, precision shooting to eliminate key leaders and disrupt command structures. The arrows themselves were designed to enhance this psychological impact. Some were fitted with whistles or other devices that created distinctive sounds in flight. Others were designed to create spectacular visual effects, trails of sparks from special heads, or unusual flight patterns that drew attention. Fire arrows were used not just for their incendiary effects, but because the sight of flaming projectiles arcing through the air had a psychological impact far beyond their actual destructive capability. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of longbow warfare was its integration with other weapons systems. The archer formations were never intended to win battles by themselves. Instead, they were designed to create the conditions that would allow other forces to achieve victory. They would disrupt enemy formations, force premature charges, eliminate key leaders, and generally create chaos that could be exploited by cavalry or infantry attacks. This combined arms approach required unprecedented levels of coordination and training. Archers had to understand not just their own role, but how their actions affected the overall tactical situation. They had to be able to shift their fire rapidly based on changing battlefield conditions, to recognize opportunities for supporting other friendly forces, and to maintain their effectiveness. Even when the battle plan fell apart, the training required to achieve this level of tactical sophistication was enormously expensive and time-consuming, but it produced military capabilities that dominated European warfare for over 2 centuries. English armies consistently defeated forces that outnumbered them by significant margins, not because they had better individual soldiers, but because they had developed more effective systems for organizing and employing their military capabilities. The longbow era represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-gunpowder military technology. Every aspect of the weapon system, from metallurgy to human physiology to tactical organization, had been pushed to its theoretical limits. Further improvement would have required fundamental changes in the underlying technologies and training methods, changes that would have been difficult to achieve within the social and economic constraints of medieval society. Instead, technological development took a different path. The same pressures that had driven longbow innovation began to produce new solutions based on gunpowder and metallurgy rather than human muscle power and organic materials. The age of firearms was beginning, and with it would come new ways of thinking about warfare, technology, and the projection of force across distance. But the lessons learned during the longbow era about specialization training, combined arms tactics, and the systematic development of military capability would continue to influence military thinking for centuries. The English longbowmen had shown what was possible when a society committed fully to developing a particular military technology, and that example would inspire future innovations in military organization and training. The song of the string had reached its crescendo, its final, perfect note echoing across the battlefields of medieval Europe, before fading into the gentler music of historical memory. There comes a moment in every technology's evolution when innovation reaches beyond the merely practical towards something approaching the mythological. For archery, that moment arrived when engineers looked at the humble bow and asked a question that would reshape the nature of warfare itself. What if we made it enormous? The siege engines that emerged from this question, trebuchets, ballistas, onagers, and their countless variations, represented more than simple scaling up of handheld weapons. They embodied a fundamental shift in how humans thought about the projection of force, the relationship between technology and military capability, and the very nature of warfare itself. The first attempts were probably straightforward enlargements of familiar weapons. A large bow mounted on a wooden frame, operated by multiple men pulling heavy drawstrings. These early experiments would have been clumsy and inefficient, but they would have demonstrated the basic principle: mechanical advantage could substitute for human muscle power, allowing the construction of weapons far more powerful than anything a single archer could operate. The ballista refined this concept into something approaching mechanical elegance. Roman engineers, with their genius for practical application of theoretical principles, developed ballistas that combined the twisted, cord-power systems of earlier weapons with precision construction techniques that produced remarkable accuracy and reliability. A typical Roman ballista was built like a giant crossbow, but with torsion springs made from twisted sinew or horsehair, providing the power instead of a bent wooden stave. The projectiles, called bolts, were essentially enormous arrows, sometimes weighing several pounds and capable of penetrating any armor or fortification of the period. The largest ballistas could shoot these bolts over distances exceeding 400 yards with accuracy sufficient to target individual soldiers on enemy walls. The psychological impact of these weapons was enormous. Imagine being a defender on a city wall, watching a ballista bolt the size of a spear flying toward you with the speed and precision of an arrow. The weapon combined the range and accuracy of archery with the devastating impact of a heavy javelin, creating a new category of military threat that had no effective counter. Roman siege tactics integrated ballistas into systematic approaches that treated fortified positions as engineering problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be overcome through brute force. Ballista batteries would be positioned to sweep enemy walls, eliminating defenders and suppressing counter fire while other siege equipment was brought into position. The weapons could maintain sustained fire for hours, wearing down defender morale and creating gaps in defensive coverage that could be exploited by assault troops. But the Romans also recognized the limitations of purely mechanical scaling. No matter how large they made their ballistas, they were still fundamentally muscle-powered weapons that required human crews to cock and aim them. The rate of fire was necessarily limited by human capabilities, and the power output was constrained by the physical properties of available materials. The solution lay in abandoning the bow principle entirely in favor of leverage systems that could harness different forms of energy. The trebuchet represented this conceptual breakthrough, a siege engine that used gravitational potential energy rather than elastic force to launch projectiles. Early trebuchets were human-powered, operated by teams of men pulling ropes to cock the throwing arm against a heavy counterweight. But the principle could be scaled almost indefinitely by increasing the size of the counterweight and the length of the throwing arm. The largest trebuchets used counterweights weighing several tons to launch projectiles of hundreds of pounds over distances exceeding 300 yards. These massive engines required substantial engineering expertise to construct and operate. The throwing arm had to be precisely balanced to achieve optimal trajectory and range. The counterweight had to be sized correctly for the intended projectile weight. The release mechanism had to trigger at exactly the right moment in the throwing cycle to achieve maximum accuracy. The projectiles themselves became specialized munitions designed for specific tactical purposes. Stone balls for battering walls and structures, incendiary devices for starting fires within besieged cities, diseased animal carcasses for biological warfare, propaganda materials, messages attached to special projectiles designed to survive impact and deliver psychological warfare content to enemy populations. Perhaps most dramatically, trebuchets could launch live prisoners back into besieged cities, sending horrific messages about the fate awaiting those who continued to resist. The sight of a human body flying through the air and crashing into a city square was calculated to break defender morale in ways that conventional military pressure could not achieve. The construction of large trebuchets became an engineering specialty that required both theoretical knowledge and practical experience. Master engineers traveled between armies, hiring out their services to construct siege trains for major campaigns. The most skilled practitioners commanded enormous fees and held positions of significant influence within military hierarchies. Chinese engineers developed trebuchet technology to extraordinary levels of sophistication. Chinese siege engines incorporated multiple throwing arms, adjustable counterweights, and precision aiming mechanisms that could place projectiles with accuracy that impressed even modern military engineers. Chinese military manuals from the Song dynasty described trebuchets capable of launching projectiles weighing over 300 pounds with sufficient accuracy to target specific buildings within enemy cities. The social and economic implications of siege engine warfare were profound. Cities that had been secure behind high walls suddenly found themselves vulnerable to bombardment from distances that made retaliation impossible. The traditional balance between offense and defense shifted dramatically in favor of attackers who could afford to construct and operate large siege trains. This change encouraged the development of new fortification designs specifically intended to counter siege engine attacks. Starforts with angled walls that could deflect projectiles. Lower, thicker walls that could absorb impact better than tall, thin medieval fortifications. Specialized structures designed to house defending artillery that could engage siege engines in counter, battery fire. The arms race between siege engines and fortifications drove innovation in both directions. Siege engineers developed new projectile types designed to overcome specific defensive measures. Castle architects incorporated features specifically intended to limit the effectiveness of trebuchet bombardment. Military engineers on both sides pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available materials and construction techniques. But siege engines also represented the beginning of the end for human-scale warfare. The enormous resources required to construct and operate large trebuchets meant that only major powers could afford them. Warfare began to favor large, centralized states over smaller, more distributed political entities. The era of the citizen-soldier began to give way to the age of professional military engineers and specialized siege trains. The transition to gunpowder weapons followed logically from these developments. Early cannons were essentially trebuchets that used chemical energy instead of gravitational potential energy to launch projectiles. The same engineering principles applied: the need for precise aiming mechanisms, specialized ammunition, and systematic approaches to siege warfare. But gunpowder offered advantages that mechanical siege engines could not match. Cannons could be made more portable than trebuchets of equivalent power. They could fire more rapidly once loaded. Most importantly, they could be produced in greater numbers because they required less specialized engineering knowledge to construct and operate. The decline of traditional siege engines was gradual rather than immediate. Trebuchets continued to be used alongside early cannons for decades, with military engineers choosing different weapons for different tactical situations. But the fundamental advantages of gunpowder technology eventually proved decisive, and mechanical siege engines gradually disappeared from European battlefields. Yet their influence on military thinking persisted long after the last trebuchet was dismantled. The siege engines had demonstrated that technological innovation could overcome traditional military advantages, that engineering expertise could be as valuable as fighting skill, and that warfare was becoming increasingly dependent on industrial capacity rather than individual courage. They had also shown that military technology could be scaled beyond human limitations through the systematic application of mechanical principles. This lesson would prove invaluable as societies began to develop the industrial capabilities that would make possible the mass production of firearms, artillery, and eventually the complex weapon systems that dominate modern warfare. The great siege engines were the final expression of pre-gunpowder military technology, the ultimate development of principles that had begun with the first bent stick and taut string in an African cave. They represented both the culmination of ancient engineering traditions and the transition to new forms of military capability that would reshape human civilization. In their shadows, the age of gunpowder was beginning, bringing with it new ways of thinking about war, technology, and the projection of human will across time and space. But the lessons learned from the great engines about engineering, organization, and the systematic development of military capability would continue to influence human development long after their massive frames had crumbled into historical memory. There is a particular melancholy in witnessing the end of an era, especially when that ending comes not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual obsolescence. The twilight of archery as a military force was like watching a master craftsman's workshop slowly empty as his apprentices drifted away to learn newer trades, until only the old master remained, still practicing his art with perfect skill for an audience that no longer existed. The first harbingers of change came not as dramatic revolutions, but as subtle shifts in the mathematics of warfare. Early firearms were crude, unreliable devices that could barely match a skilled archer's range and accuracy. The first handguns of the 14th century were as dangerous to their operators as to their enemies, prone to misfiring, impossible to aim with precision, and requiring so much time to reload that an archer could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took a gunner to prepare a second shot. Yet these primitive weapons carried within them the seeds of transformation. Unlike archery, which required years of training to master and decades of practice to maintain, firearms could be operated effectively by soldiers with minimal preparation. A peasant conscript could be taught to load and fire a musket in a matter of days, while creating an effective archer required the kind of long-term investment that few societies could afford on a massive scale. More importantly, gunpowder weapons offered something that no amount of archery training could provide: the ability to penetrate any armor ever made. The best plate armor of the late medieval period, crafted by master armorers using techniques refined over centuries, could turn aside even bodkin points from the most powerful longbows. But a musket ball, heavy and moving at tremendous velocity, could punch through steel plates as if they were made of paper. This capability fundamentally altered the strategic calculations that had governed warfare for millennia. Suddenly, the enormous investments that kingdoms had made in heavy cavalry and plate armor were rendered obsolete by weapons that could be mass-produced by relatively unskilled workers. The social structures that had been built around the military supremacy of armored elites began to crumble under pressure from technologies that democratized the ability to kill. The transition was neither immediate nor uniform. For decades, armies fielded both archers and gunners, using each weapon system for tasks suited to its particular strengths. Archers retained advantages in rate of fire, accuracy at moderate ranges, and reliability in wet weather that kept them valuable even as firearms improved. The English maintained archer units well into the 16th century, and some military theorists argued that bows would always have a place in warfare due to their silent operation and independence from gunpowder supplies. But the trajectory of technological development was clear. Each generation of firearms was more reliable, more powerful, and easier to use than the last. Matchlock mechanisms gave way to wheelock and flintlock systems that reduced misfires and simplified operation. Barrel manufacturing techniques improved to the point where muskets could achieve accuracy that reveled the best archers. Most critically, the costs of gunpowder weapons decreased as production methods became more efficient and standardized. The social implications of this transition were profound and far-reaching. Archery had been inherently aristocratic in its requirements. Only societies with significant leisure time and economic surplus could afford to maintain large numbers of skilled archers. Firearms, by contrast, could be operated by anyone capable of following simple instructions, opening military service to classes of people who had previously been excluded from combat roles. This democratization of warfare contributed to broader social and political changes that reshaped European civilization. Rulers who had depended on feudal levies and aristocratic heavy cavalry found themselves able to field professional armies recruited from the general population. The military balance shifted in favor of centralized states that could afford to equip large numbers of soldiers with standardized weapons, while traditional warrior elites found their military advantages neutralized by technological change. The economic implications were equally dramatic. The industries that had grown up around archery production, bowyers, fletchers, arrowsmiths, and the complex supply chains that supported them, gradually withered as demand for their products declined. Entire regions that had specialized in producing use staves or high-quality arrows found their traditional exports becoming obsolete virtually overnight. New industries emerged to replace them. Gunpowder production required different skills and materials, creating opportunities for entrepreneurs who could master the chemistry of explosives. Firearms manufacturing demanded precision metalworking capabilities that drove innovation in metallurgy and machine tools. The logistics of supplying armies with gunpowder, shot, and spare parts created new forms of military contracting and international trade. The transformation also changed the nature of military training and organization. Archer units had required long-term investment in individual skill development, creating military specialists whose effectiveness depended on years of accumulated experience. Firearms units could be trained more quickly, but required different forms of organization to coordinate their fire effectively and maintain their equipment properly. The tactical implications rippled through every aspect of military science. Fortification design had to be completely reconceived to deal with weapons that could breach walls that had been impregnable for centuries. Military engineering became focused on artillery rather than siege engines. The pace of combat accelerated as weapons became more lethal and engagements became more decisive. Perhaps most poignantly, the decline of archery represented the end of a particular relationship between human capability and technological achievement. The longbow had represented the absolute pinnacle of what could be accomplished through the marriage of natural materials, human skill, and accumulated wisdom. It was a technology that enhanced human capability without replacing it. That required the archer to become part of the weapon system rather than simply operating it. Firearms represented a different philosophy of technology, one that emphasized mechanical reliability over human skill, standardization over individual excellence, industrial production over craftsmanship. The musketeer was an operator of machinery rather than a practitioner of art. The weapon's effectiveness depended on its design and manufacture rather than on the user's training and experience. This shift marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between humans and their tools. For the first time, military effectiveness became dependent more on technological superiority than on individual or collective human capability. The implications of this change would continue to unfold over subsequent centuries as technology became increasingly sophisticated and human operators became increasingly peripheral to military systems. Yet the end of military archery was not complete abandonment. The skills and knowledge that had been developed over millennia of bow use found new applications in hunting, sport, and ceremonial contexts. Archery persisted as a form of recreation and competition, preserving techniques and traditions that might otherwise have been lost entirely. More importantly, the principles that had been learned through archery development continued to influence technological innovation in other fields. The understanding of materials science that had been developed through bow construction contributed to advances in metallurgy and engineering. The precision manufacturing techniques required for arrow production informed the development of industrial processes. The systematic approaches to training and skill development that had been refined through archery-influenced educational and military training methods. The organizational lessons learned through managing archer units. The importance of standardization, the value of specialized training, the need for reliable supply systems became fundamental principles of modern military organization. The economic understanding developed through supporting archery-based warfare-informed approaches to military logistics and industrial mobilization that would prove crucial in later conflicts. In the end, the twilight of military archery represented not the death of a technology, but its transformation. The bow and arrow had taught humanity crucial lessons about the relationship between human capability and technological achievement, lessons that would prove invaluable as societies grappled with increasingly complex and powerful technologies. The last military archers drew their bows knowing that they were practicing an art that would soon be relegated to historical curiosity, but they also carried forward traditions of precision, dedication, and systematic excellence that would continue to influence human development long after their weapons were silent. The song of the string faded gradually rather than ending abruptly, its final notes echoing through centuries of human memory, reminding us that true technological achievement is never just about the tools themselves, but about the human wisdom and capability that brings those tools to life. In quiet moments, when the wind moves through trees with a sound like bowstrings singing, we can still hear echoes of that ancient music, the song that taught us how to reach beyond our grasp, how to bend the world to our will, how to transform simple materials into instruments of extraordinary capability through patience, skill, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who dared to dream of making the impossible possible. Before we speak of endings, we must understand that the bow and arrow was never merely a tool of survival or conquest. It was, from its very beginning, a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, a means by which humans connected with forces larger than themselves. In every culture that adopted the bow, it became wrapped in ceremony and myth, invested with meanings that transcended its practical applications. The hunt itself was never just about acquiring food. It was a sacred transaction between human and animal, predator and prey, a dance of death and life that required not just skill but spiritual preparation. The archer became a mediator in this ancient contract, responsible for ensuring that the taking of life was done with proper respect, appropriate ceremony, and acknowledgement of the greater powers that governed the natural world. In the caves where our ancestors painted their dreams and visions on stone walls, archers appear not as mere hunters but as shamanic figures, beings who could transcend the boundaries between worlds. The Sand people of the Kalahari, whose ancestors were among the first to master the bow, speak of the trance dance that hunters perform before setting out on important hunts, rituals that connect them to the spirit realm, where animals give permission to be taken. These ceremonies recognize something profound about the nature of archery itself. The moment when an arrow is released is a moment of absolute surrender, when human intention joins with forces beyond human control. The archer must let go completely, trusting that their preparation, their skill, and their spiritual alignment will guide the arrow to its destined target. In this moment of release, the boundary between self and world dissolves, and the archer becomes one with the flight of the arrow itself. Native American traditions understood this mystical dimension of archery with particular depth. The bow was not just a weapon, but a sacred instrument, often blessed by medicine men and incorporated into ceremonies that honored the spirits of the animals being hunted. The Cherokee spoke of arrows that carried prayers, projectiles that were vehicles for human intention to reach the spirit world and request permission for the hunt to proceed. The making of arrows became a ritual act in itself. Each step of the process, selecting the wood, knapping the point, gathering the feathers, binding everything together with sinew and glue, was performed with ceremonial attention to spiritual, as well as practical requirements. The arrow maker was not just a craftsman but a priest, responsible for creating objects that would serve as intermediaries between human need and natural abundance. Plains tribes developed elaborate ceremonies around the sacred arrows that served as tribal talismans, objects so holy that their loss could mean the spiritual death of an entire people. These arrows were believed to contain the concentrated power of the tribe's connection to the natural world, and their care and protection was entrusted to specially trained keepers who devoted their lives to maintaining these sacred objects. The Lakota understood the bow as a symbol of the male principle in nature, while the arrow represented the focused intention that could bridge the gap between desire and fulfillment. Young men underwent vision quests, partly to learn how to align their personal will with the greater forces that governed the movement of game animals and the success of hunts. The bow taught them about the balance between effort and surrender, control and release, that governed all successful action in the world. In the forests of medieval Europe, archery took on different, but equally profound spiritual dimensions. The longbow yeoman was not just a soldier, but a guardian of ancient forest wisdom, keeper of knowledge about the secret lives of trees and animals that had been passed down through generations of woodsmen and hunters. The great yew trees from which the finest bows were made were regarded as sacred beings, and their harvest was surrounded by ceremonies that acknowledged the sacrifice being made by these ancient guardians of the forest. Robin Hood and the countless other archer, heroes of European folklore, were never just outlaws or soldiers, but spiritual figures who embodied humanity's relationship with the wild world that civilization was rapidly displacing. They represented the part of human nature that remained connected to older, deeper sources of wisdom and power that could not be contained within the walls of castles or the boundaries of cultivated fields. The target itself became a mandala in many traditions, a symbol of cosmic order and spiritual achievement. Japanese kyudo practitioners speak of shooting not at a target but through it, using the physical act of archery to pierce the illusions that separate the practitioner from ultimate reality. The bullseye represents the still point at the center of all movement, the place where all opposites resolve into unity. Zen masters used archery as a teaching tool for students struggling to understand the nature of effortless action, the paradox of achieving goals through the complete abandonment of goal-seeking. The perfect shot, they taught, happens when there is no archer, no bow, no target, only the natural movement of the universe expressing itself through human form. This spiritual dimension of archery explains why the bow continued to fascinate humanity long after it had lost its practical importance. In cultures around the world, archery persisted as a meditative practice, a form of moving prayer that connected practitioners with dimensions of experience that modern life tends to obscure. The mythology surrounding famous archers reveals the archetypal power of the bow and arrow in human consciousness. Odysseus' bow, which only he could string, represented not just physical strength, but spiritual authority, the right to rule that came from complete mastery of the forces represented by the weapon. The fact that his son Telemachus could eventually string the bow as well symbolized the proper transmission of wisdom and power from one generation to the next. Apollo's silver bow was the instrument through which divine justice manifested in the world. When the god drew his bowstring, plague arrows flew forth to punish those who had violated cosmic law. But the same bow could also bring healing, for Apollo was simultaneously the god of disease and medicine, destruction and renewal. The bow represented the divine power that both destroys and creates, that brings death so that new life might emerge. Artemis, the virgin huntress, embodied the wild, untamed aspect of nature that could never be fully domesticated or controlled. Her bow was the weapon of the wilderness itself, the power that maintained the balance between human civilization and the natural world that sustained it. Those who forgot to honor this balance, who took more than they needed, or failed to show proper respect for the animals they hunted, found themselves on the receiving end of her arrow, swift justice. In Hindu tradition, the bow of Arjuna was blessed by the gods themselves and could never miss its intended target. But the great archer learned, through his dialogue with Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, that true mastery of the bow required understanding the deeper principles of Dharma, righteous action performed without attachment to results. The physical skill of archery became a metaphor for spiritual development, the gradual alignment of personal will with cosmic purpose. The Norse god Odin was master of the bow and skis, patron of hunters who travelled through winter forests in pursuit of game that meant the difference between survival and starvation. His worship involved ceremonies performed in deep winter, acknowledgements that human life depended on forces beyond human control, and required spiritual as well as physical preparation to navigate successfully. Chinese mythology speaks of the archer Hou Yi, who saved the world by shooting down 9 of the 10 suns that were scorching the earth. This story encodes deep wisdom about the archer's role as maintainer of cosmic balance, the one who can strike precisely at sources of imbalance to restore harmony to the world. The archer becomes a cosmic figure, wielding power that can literally reshape the heavens. Islamic tradition preserved elaborate treatises on archery that were simultaneously technical manuals and and spiritual guides. The great archer was understood to be one who had achieved perfect alignment between inner state and outer action, whose arrows flew true because their heart was pure and their intention was aligned with divine will. The bow became an instrument of worship, a means of expressing devotion through the pursuit of physical and spiritual perfection. These mythological and spiritual traditions remind us that archery was never just about hitting targets, but about achieving a state of consciousness in which human intention could manifest perfectly in the physical world. The bow taught practitioners about the relationship between preparation and spontaneity, effort and surrender, individual will and universal law. The meditative aspects of archery practice developed sophisticated understandings of consciousness, an attention that paralleled and sometimes surpassed formal philosophical and psychological systems. The archer learned to maintain perfect focus while remaining completely relaxed, to aim with absolute precision while letting go of attachment to results, to coordinate complex physical movements while maintaining inner stillness. These insights influenced approaches to education, spiritual practice, and personal development in ways that extended far beyond archery itself. The understanding that true mastery required not just technical skill but wisdom, not just practice but presence, not just effort but understanding. These principles became fundamental to human approaches to excellence in every field of endeavor. The ceremonial uses of archery also preserved knowledge and traditions that might otherwise have been lost as human societies became more urbanized and disconnected from natural cycles. Archery competitions and demonstrations maintained skills and awareness that connected people to older ways of knowing and being, serving as bridges between ancient wisdom and contemporary life. In our modern world, where technology increasingly mediates our relationship with the physical environment, the bow and arrow retains its power as a symbol of direct, unmediated connection between human intention and natural result. The archer still faces the same fundamental challenge that confronted the first human to draw a bowstring: how to coordinate mind and body, effort and surrender, preparation and spontaneity in service of a clear intention. This is why archery continues to fascinate and inspire people long after its practical applications have become obsolete. It offers a form of practice that develops not just physical skill, but spiritual awareness, not just hand-eye coordination, but the kind of integrated consciousness that our fragmented modern existence often fails to cultivate. Every arrow that flies true carries forward the accumulated wisdom of 70,000 years of human engagement with the mystery of intentional action. Every bowstring song echoes the prayers and ceremonies of countless generations who understood that the bow was not just a tool, but a teacher, not just a weapon, but a bridge between the world as it is, and the world as it might become through human dedication to excellence and wisdom. The story of the bow and arrow did not end with the last military archer laying down his weapon. Like all truly transformative technologies, its influence continued to ripple through human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, shaping developments that seem far removed from the simple act of drawing a string and releasing an arrow. In the workshops where the first firearms were being perfected, gunmakers unconsciously applied lessons learned from centuries of bow construction. The understanding of how materials behave under stress, developed through generations of bow making, informed the design of gun barrels that could withstand the explosive forces of gunpowder. The precision required to create arrows that would fly true translated into manufacturing tolerances that made firearms more accurate and reliable. The systematic approaches to training that had been developed for archers became templates for drilling soldiers in the use of firearms. The emphasis on consistent, repeatable motions that had been crucial for archery translated directly into the manual of arms that taught musket ears to load and fire their weapons with mechanical precision. The understanding that effective military units required not just individual skill, but coordinated action informed the development of linear tactics that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. Even the industrial processes that would eventually mass produce firearms owed debts to archery traditions. The quality control systems that ensured arrows from different Fletchers would perform consistently became models for standardizing manufactured goods. The supply chain management required to keep archer units equipped with thousands of arrows informed approaches to military logistics that would prove crucial as armies became larger and more technologically complex. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the bow lay in the realm of human consciousness itself. For 70,000 years, archery had been teaching our species crucial lessons about the relationship between intention and result, between patient practice and extraordinary achievement, between individual capability and technological amplification. Every archer who ever drew a bow had to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of skill and mastery. How do you coordinate mind and body to achieve precision at distance? How do you maintain focus under pressure? How do you develop the kind of intuitive understanding that allows complex actions to be performed without conscious thought? These were not just technical questions but philosophical ones, and the answers that emerged from archery practice influenced human thinking in areas far removed from warfare or hunting. The meditative aspects of archery, the requirement for complete presence and focused attention, contributed to contemplative traditions in cultures around the world. In Japan, Kyudo emerged as a spiritual discipline that used the bow as a tool for self-cultivation rather than combat. The practitioner sought not just to hit targets, but to achieve a state of perfect balance between intention and action, effort and relaxation, self and environment. The bow became a teacher, showing students how to harmonize their inner nature with external requirements. Zen Buddhist traditions incorporated archery as a method for understanding the nature of mind itself. The moment of release, when the archer must let go of conscious control and trust in their training, became a metaphor for the spiritual release required for enlightenment. The arrow's flight represented the natural action that emerges when human effort aligns perfectly with universal principles. Similar traditions developed in other cultures. Islamic archery treatises discussed the bow as a tool for developing the kind of focused attention required for prayer and meditation. European hunting manuals described archery practice as a form of character development that taught patience, discipline, and respect for the natural world. These spiritual and philosophical dimensions of archery influenced thinking about education and human development in ways that continue to resonate today. The understanding that true mastery requires not just technical knowledge but wisdom, not just practice but patience, not just effort but understanding. These insights shaped approaches to learning that extended far beyond archery itself. The bow also taught crucial lessons about the relationship between humans and their tools. Unlike many technologies that simply amplify human capability, the bow required the user to become part of the system. The archer had to adapt their body, their breathing, their mental state to work in harmony with the weapon. Success depended not on overpowering the tool, but on understanding it, cooperating with it, becoming one with it. This model of human technology interaction influenced approaches to tool design and use in countless other fields. The idea that the best tools are those that enhance rather than replace human capability, that require user skill rather than simply user compliance, can be traced back to insights first developed through archery practice. Modern sports psychology owes enormous debts to knowledge accumulated through millennia of archery training. The understanding of how to develop and maintain focus under pressure, how to coordinate complex physical movements with mental intention, how to achieve the kind of relaxed alertness that allows peak performance. All of these insights were first systematically explored through archery practice. The precision manufacturing techniques required for making arrows contributed to the development of quality control methods that would become fundamental to industrial production. The idea that small variations in materials or construction could have large effects on performance was learned through arrow making long before it was applied to manufactured goods. The systematic testing methods used to evaluate arrow performance became models for product testing in other industries. Even the mathematical and scientific understanding required for ballistics was first developed through archery. The need to understand trajectory, wind effects, and the relationship between force and accuracy led to investigations into physics and mathematics that would eventually contribute to much more sophisticated analyses of projectile motion. The social and organizational lessons learned through managing archer units influenced military and civilian administration in ways that persist today. The understanding that effective organizations require not just individual competence, but systematic coordination, not just good equipment, but reliable supply chains, not just immediate capability, but long-term sustainability. These insights were first developed through the challenges of maintaining effective archery forces. The bow also provided early lessons in the economics of technological innovation. The enormous costs required to train and equip effective archers taught societies about the relationship between investment and capability, between short-term expense and long-term advantage. The trade-offs between different weapons systems, atlatls versus bows, crossbows versus longbows, arrows versus firearms, provided case studies in technological choice that would inform decision-making about innovations throughout history. Perhaps most importantly, the bow and arrow established patterns of human innovation that continue to shape technological development today. The process of taking a simple natural phenomenon, the elasticity of wood, and gradually refining it into a sophisticated system through patient experimentation and accumulated knowledge became a template for technological advancement in countless other fields. The bow showed that transformative innovations often emerge not from sudden breakthroughs, but from the systematic improvement of existing capabilities. It demonstrated that the most powerful technologies are often those that work with rather than against natural principles. It proved that human intelligence, applied persistently over long periods of time, could achieve results that seemed impossible to earlier generations. In our current age of rapid technological change, these lessons remain profoundly relevant. As we grapple with artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and other transformative innovations, we can still learn from the wisdom accumulated through 70,000 years of bow development. The bow teaches us that true technological mastery requires not just understanding how tools work, but wisdom about when and how to use them. It reminds us that the most important innovations are often those that enhance rather than replace human capability. It shows us that sustainable technological development requires thinking not just about immediate capabilities, but about long-term consequences and requirements. Most fundamentally, the bow and arrow remind us that technology at its best is not separate from human nature, but an expression of it. The first archer who bent a stick and attached a string was not creating something alien to human experience, but discovering something that had always been latent within human possibility. In every arrow that flies true to its target, we see reflected the human capacity for precision, patience, and the transformation of simple materials into extraordinary capability. In every bowstring song, we hear echoes of the same creativity and ingenuity that continues to drive human innovation today. The story of the bow and arrow did not end with the last military archer laying down his weapon. Like all truly transformative technologies, its influence continued to ripple through human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, shaping developments that seem far removed from the simple act of drawing a string and releasing an arrow. In the workshops where the first firearms were being perfected, gunmakers unconsciously applied lessons learned from centuries of bow construction. The understanding of how materials behave under stress, developed through generations of bow making, informed the design of gun barrels that could withstand the explosive forces of gunpowder. The precision required to create arrows that would fly true translated into manufacturing tolerances that made firearms more accurate and reliable. The systematic approaches to training that had been developed for archers became templates for drilling soldiers in the use of firearms. The emphasis on consistent, repeatable motions that had been crucial for archery translated directly into the manual of arms, that taught musketeers to load and fire their weapons with mechanical precision. The understanding that effective military units required not just individual skill, but coordinated action informed the development of linear tactics that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. Even the industrial processes that would eventually mass produce firearms owed debts to archery traditions. The quality control systems that ensured arrows from different Fletchers would perform consistently became models for standardizing manufactured goods. The supply chain management required to keep archer units equipped with thousands of arrows informed approaches to military logistics that would prove crucial as armies became larger and more technologically complex. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the bow lay in the realm of human consciousness itself. For 70,000 years, archery had been teaching our species crucial lessons about the relationship between intention and result, between patient practice and extraordinary achievement, between individual capability and technological amplification. Every archer who ever drew a bow had to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of skill and mastery. How do you coordinate mind and body to achieve precision at distance? How do you maintain focus under pressure? How do you develop the kind of intuitive understanding that allows complex actions to be performed without conscious thought? These were not just technical questions, but philosophical ones, and the answers that emerged from archery practice influenced human thinking in areas far removed from warfare or hunting. The meditative aspects of archery, the requirement for complete presence and focused attention, contributed to contemplative traditions in cultures around the world. In Japan, Kyudo emerged as a spiritual discipline that used the bow as a tool for self-cultivation rather than combat. The practitioner sought not just to hit targets, but to achieve a state of perfect balance between intention and action, effort and relaxation, self and environment. The bow became a teacher, showing students how to harmonize their inner nature with external requirements. Zen Buddhist traditions incorporated archery as a method for understanding the nature of mind itself. The moment of release, when the archer must let go of conscious control and trust in their training, became a metaphor for the spiritual release required for enlightenment. The arrow's flight represented the natural action that emerges when human effort aligns perfectly with universal principles. Similar traditions developed in other cultures. Islamic archery treatises discussed the bow as a tool for developing the kind of focused attention required for prayer and meditation. European hunting manuals described archery practice as a form of character development that taught patience, discipline, and respect for the natural world. These spiritual and philosophical dimensions of archery influenced thinking about education and human development in ways that continue to resonate today. The understanding that true mastery requires not just technical knowledge but wisdom, not just practice but patience, not just effort but understanding. These insights shaped approaches to learning that extended far beyond archery itself. The bow also taught crucial lessons about the relationship between humans and their tools. Unlike many technologies that simply amplify human capability, the bow required the user to become part of the system. The archer had to adapt their body, their breathing, their mental state to work in harmony with the weapon. Success depended not on overpowering the tool, but on understanding it, cooperating with it, becoming one with it. This model of human-technology interaction influenced approaches to tool design and use in countless other fields. The idea that the best tools are those that enhance rather than replace human capability, that require user skill rather than simply user compliance, can be traced back to insights first developed through archery practice. Modern sports psychology owes enormous debts to knowledge accumulated through millennia of archery training. The understanding of how to develop and maintain focus under pressure, how to coordinate complex physical movements with mental intention, how to achieve the kind of relaxed alertness that allows peak performance. All of these insights were first systematically explored through archery practice. The precision manufacturing techniques required for making arrows contributed to the development of quality control methods that would become fundamental to industrial production. The idea that small variations in materials or construction could have large effects on performance was learned through arrow, making long before it was applied to manufactured goods. The systematic testing methods used to evaluate arrow performance became models for product testing in other industries. Even the mathematical and scientific understanding required for ballistics was first developed through archery. The need to understand trajectory, wind effects, and the relationship between force and accuracy led to investigations into physics and mathematics that would eventually contribute to much more sophisticated analyses of projectile motion. The social and organizational lessons learned through managing archer units influenced military and civilian administration in ways that persist today. The understanding that effective organizations require not just individual competence, but systematic coordination, not just good equipment, but reliable supply chains, not just immediate capability, but long-term sustainability. These insights were first developed through the challenges of maintaining effective archery forces. The bow also provided early lessons in the economics of technological innovation. The enormous costs required to train and equip effective archers taught societies about the relationship between investment and capability, between short-term expense and long-term advantage, the trade-offs between different weapon systems, atlatls versus bows, crossbows versus longbows, arrows versus firearms, provided case studies in technological choice that would inform decision-making about innovations throughout history. Perhaps most importantly, the bow and arrow established patterns of human innovation that continue to shape technological development today. The process of taking a simple natural phenomenon, the elasticity of wood, and gradually refining it into a sophisticated system through patient experimentation and accumulated knowledge became a template for technological advancement in countless other fields. The bow showed that transformative innovations often emerged not from sudden breakthroughs, but from the systematic improvement of existing capabilities. It demonstrated that the most powerful technologies are often those that work with rather than against natural principles. It proved that human intelligence, applied persistently over long periods of time, could achieve results that seemed impossible to earlier generations. In our current age of rapid technological change, these lessons remain profoundly relevant. As we grapple with artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and other transformative innovations, we can still learn from the wisdom accumulated through 70,000 years of bow development. The bow teaches us that true technological mastery requires not just understanding how tools work, but wisdom about when and how to use them. It reminds us that the most important innovations are often those that enhance, rather than replace, human capability. It shows us that sustainable technological development requires thinking not just about immediate capabilities, but about long-term consequences and requirements. Most fundamentally, the bow and arrow remind us that technology, at its best, is not separate from human nature, but an expression of it. The first archer who bent a stick and attached a string was not creating something alien to human experience, but discovering something that had always been latent within human possibility. In every arrow that flies true to its target, we see reflected the human capacity for precision, patience, and the transformation of simple materials into extraordinary capability. In every bowstring song, we hear echoes of the same creativity and ingenuity that continues to drive human innovation today. The bow's legacy lives on not just in museums and sporting events, but in the fundamental patterns of human technological development that it helped establish. Every time we pick up a new tool and work to master it, every time we practice a skill until it becomes second nature, every time we seek to extend our reach beyond our immediate grasp, we are following paths first traced by ancient archers whose dedication to excellence continues to inspire us across the centuries. But the bow's influence extends even into realms that seem completely divorced from its ancient origins. The computer programmers who debug complex software are applying the same systematic patience that ancient fletchers used to perfect their arrows. The athletes who train for Olympic competition are following training methodologies that can be traced back to archery masters who understood the relationship between mind and body, preparation and performance. The architects who design buildings that stand for centuries are using principles of stress and material science that were first explored by bow makers who needed to understand how wood behaves under extreme forces. The musicians who spend years perfecting their technique are engaging with the same questions about practice, mastery, and the coordination of intention with physical expression that challenged every archer who ever drew a bow. Even the meditation teachers who guide students toward states of focused awareness are drawing upon insights that were first systematically developed through archery practice. The understanding that peak performance requires a state of relaxed concentration, that true skill emerges from the marriage of effort and surrender, that mastery involves becoming one with one's tools rather than fighting against them. These insights emerged from thousands of years of archery practice and continue to inform human approaches to excellence in every field. The space engineers who calculate trajectories for interplanetary missions are applying mathematical principles that were first explored by archers trying to understand how arrows behave in flight. The precision manufacturing techniques that make modern electronics possible evolved from quality control methods that were first developed to ensure that arrows would perform consistently. The team coordination methods used in modern corporations often reflect organizational principles that were first worked out by military commanders trying to coordinate the fire of large archer formations. The supply chain management systems that keep global commerce functioning evolved from logistics techniques that were first developed to keep archer units supplied with arrows in the field. Even the user interface design principles that make modern technology accessible and intuitive often reflect insights about human-tool interaction that were first developed through archery practice. The idea that the best interfaces are those that become transparent to the user, that allow intention to flow directly into action without conscious mediation, can be traced back to the archer's goal of becoming one with their weapon. In the realm of education, the bow's legacy is particularly strong. The understanding that true learning requires not just the transmission of information, but the development of integrated skill, not just knowledge but wisdom, not just practice but understanding. These insights shaped educational approaches that persist today. The concept of apprenticeship, where students learn through patient practice under the guidance of master teachers, was refined through thousands of years of archery instruction. The understanding that mastery cannot be rushed, that it requires time for knowledge to be integrated into intuitive understanding, emerged from the recognition that becoming an effective archer required years of dedicated practice. The idea that the best teachers are those who can adapt their instruction to the individual needs and capabilities of each student was developed through archery training, where masters learned that different students required different approaches to achieve the same ultimate goal of accurate, consistent shooting. Perhaps most importantly, the bow established the understanding that education at its best is not about filling passive vessels with information, but about awakening capabilities that already exist within students. The archer was not created by the teacher, but awakened by the teaching, guided to discover and develop potential that was always present but needed cultivation to manifest. This educational philosophy continues to influence progressive approaches to learning and development today. The recognition that true education must engage the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, that it must develop not just technical skills but wisdom and character, can be traced back to archery traditions that understood the bow as a tool for complete human development. In the end, the bow and arrow represent something more than just a weapon or tool that happened to influence subsequent technological development. They represent a fundamental pattern of human engagement with the world, the recognition that through patient practice, systematic observation, and accumulated wisdom, human beings can transcend their apparent limitations and achieve capabilities that seem impossible from the perspective of unaided biology. This pattern continues to operate in every field of human endeavor. Whether we are learning to play a musical instrument, mastering a sport, developing artistic skills, or advancing scientific knowledge, we are following the same basic process that produced the first successful archer: identifying a goal that seems beyond our current capability, breaking down the challenge into manageable components, practicing systematically until isolated skills become integrated capability, and gradually pushing the boundaries of what we thought possible. The bow reminds us that human potential is not fixed by biology or circumstance, but can be extended indefinitely through intelligence, dedication, and the accumulated wisdom of those who have walked similar paths before us. It shows us that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest tools and the most patient practice. Most importantly, it demonstrates that technology at its best does not replace human capability, but amplifies it, that the most powerful tools are those that require and reward human skill, rather than making it obsolete. In an age when artificial intelligence and automation threaten to make human capabilities irrelevant, the bow reminds us that there will always be value in the kind of integrated mastery that emerges from the marriage of human intelligence with properly designed tools. The song of the bowstring continues to echo through human consciousness, reminding us of our capacity for precision, patience, and the systematic development of capability that can transform the impossible into the everyday. In every new skill we master, every tool we learn to use with fluency, every goal we achieve through dedicated practice, we honor the legacy of those ancient archers who first showed us that human beings need not accept the limitations they inherit, but can transcend them through wisdom, patience, and the willingness to practice until practice itself becomes a form of prayer. In the Silicon Valleys of our digital age, where algorithms process more information in seconds than ancient civilizations accumulated in lifetimes, the principles first discovered through archery continue to operate in ways that would astound our ancestors. The bow and arrow, that ancient marriage of simple materials and patient skill, has become a template for understanding how humans can maintain agency and meaning in an age of artificial intelligence and automated systems. Consider the video game designer who must balance challenge and reward to create experiences that engage players without overwhelming them. They are applying the same understanding of human psychology that archery masters developed over millennia. The knowledge that growth requires challenge, that mastery emerges from the sweet spot between effort and ability, that the most satisfying achievements are those that require genuine skill while remaining achievable through dedicated practice. The principles of archery have found unexpected resonance in the design of virtual reality systems, where developers struggle to create interfaces that feel natural and intuitive. The best VR experiences are those that become transparent to the user, where the technology disappears and intention flows directly into action, exactly the state that archers sought to achieve with their bows. Motion capture technology used in filmmaking and animation often employs archery as a benchmark for natural human movement. The archer's draw and release represents one of the most complex coordinated actions the human body can perform, requiring precise timing of multiple muscle groups while maintaining overall fluidity and grace. Animators study archer movements to understand how to make digital characters move with convincing realism. The precision manufacturing techniques that enable modern electronics trace their lineage directly back to arrow-making traditions. The quality control methods that ensure microprocessors function correctly evolved from systems first developed to ensure that arrows would fly true. The understanding that tiny variations in materials or construction can have enormous effects on performance was learned through arrow-making long before, was applied to silicon wafers and integrated circuits. Even artificial intelligence systems reflect principles first discovered through archery practice. Machine learning algorithms that improve through repetition mirror the way archers developed skill through thousands of practice shots. The concept of neural networks that process information in parallel patterns resembles the way an experienced archer's nervous system coordinates multiple sensory inputs and motor outputs without conscious control. The feedback loops that allow AI systems to learn from their mistakes and gradually improve performance are essentially digital versions of the self-correction mechanisms that archers develop to refine their technique. The process of adjusting aim based on where previous arrows landed, of modifying technique based on results, became a template for how machines could be taught to learn from experience. Modern robotics engineers studying precision movement often return to archery as a model for how complex actions can be performed with both accuracy and grace. The industrial robots that manufacture everything from automobiles to smartphones employ control systems that mirror the way archers learn to coordinate multiple variables: force, timing, trajectory, environmental conditions, to achieve consistent results. The emergence of competitive esports has created new forms of archery, like challenge, that test the same fundamental skills that made archers formidable warriors. Professional gamers develop the same kind of focused attention, precise hand-eye coordination, and ability to perform under pressure that characterized the greatest archers in history. The reaction times and precision required for elite gaming performance often exceed what was demanded of historical archers. But perhaps most significantly, the bow and arrow has become a powerful metaphor for understanding human agency in an age of increasing automation. As machines become capable of performing more tasks that were once exclusively human, the archer's relationship with their bow offers a model for how humans can maintain meaningful control and purpose. The archer was never passive in relation to their weapon. Success required active engagement, continuous adjustment, and the development of integrated skill that could not be separated from the person who wielded the bow. This model suggests that the most valuable forms of human-technology interaction are those that require and reward human skill rather than making it obsolete. In the field of human-computer interaction, designers increasingly recognize that the most effective interfaces are those that work with rather than against natural human capabilities. Touchscreens that respond to gesture, voice recognition systems that adapt to individual speech patterns, and haptic feedback systems that provide tactile information all reflect the archery principle that the best tools are extensions of human capability rather than replacements for it. The mindfulness and meditation practices that have become popular in technology companies often draw explicitly from archery traditions. Tech workers struggling with information overload and constant connectivity find in archery practice a form of training that develops the kind of focused attention and present moment awareness that seems increasingly rare in digital environments. Olympic archery itself has been transformed by digital technology with electronic scoring systems, high-speed cameras for technique analysis, and computer modeling of arrow flight. Yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. The archer must still draw the bow, aim carefully, and release at precisely the right moment. Technology enhances the sport, but cannot replace the human skills at its core. The data analytics revolution that has transformed everything from business to sports often employs visualization techniques that descend from archery practice. The ability to see patterns in complex data, to identify targets of opportunity, to aim strategic interventions with precision. These skills reflect the same visual, spatial intelligence that archers developed through centuries of practice. Even the user experience design principles that make modern software accessible and intuitive often reflect insights first developed through archery instruction. The understanding that complex skills must be broken down into manageable components, that practice must be structured to build progressively toward mastery, that feedback must be immediate and clear. These principles were refined through archery teaching long before they were applied to digital education platforms. The gamification techniques used to make learning and behavior change more engaging frequently employ archery metaphors and mechanics. Progress bars that fill as users advance toward goals, achievement systems that reward precision and consistency, and difficulty curves that maintain optimal challenge levels all reflect principles first discovered through archery practice. In the realm of cybersecurity, the concept of targeted attacks, employs archery metaphors to describe how digital threats are aimed with precision at specific vulnerabilities. Security professionals speak of attack vectors and use penetration testing techniques that mirror the way archers learned to find weak points in enemy defenses. The project management methodologies that coordinate complex technological development often reflect organizational principles first worked out by military commanders coordinating archer formations. Agile development practices that emphasize rapid iteration and continuous improvement mirror the way archers refine their technique through constant practice and adjustment. Even the recommendation algorithms that suggest content on social media platforms employ targeting principles that would be familiar to ancient archers. The ability to predict user behavior and deliver precisely aimed content reflects the same understanding of psychology and probability that allowed skilled archers to anticipate where moving targets would be when their arrows arrived. The virtual and augmented reality training systems, used to teach everything from surgery to space exploration, often incorporate archery, like challenges to develop the hand, eye coordination and spatial awareness required for complex technical tasks. The fundamental skills that made someone an effective archer, precise control, depth perception, timing, and the ability to coordinate multiple variables simultaneously, remain valuable in technological contexts that would have been unimaginable to ancient practitioners. Perhaps most importantly, the bow and arrow offers a model for how humans can maintain dignity and purpose in relationship with increasingly powerful technologies. The archer was never diminished by their weapon, but enhanced by it. The bow required human skill to function effectively, and rewarded that skill with capabilities that exceeded what was possible through unaided effort. This model suggests pathways for human development in technological societies that emphasize collaboration rather than competition between human and artificial intelligence. Just as the archer and bow formed an integrated system that was more capable than either component alone, humans and AI might develop partnerships that enhance rather than replace human capability. The patience and long-term perspective required for archery mastery offer valuable lessons for navigating technological change that often seems to accelerate beyond human comprehension. The archer's understanding that true skill develops gradually through sustained practice provides a counterbalance to digital culture's emphasis on instant gratification and rapid obsolescence. Most fundamentally, archery reminds us that some forms of human capability cannot be digitized or automated away. The integration of mind and body, the development of intuitive understanding through practice, the cultivation of character through patient effort, these aspects of human development remain as relevant today as they were 70,000 years ago. In every line of code that requires human creativity to write, every user interface that must account for human psychology to function effectively, every AI system that needs human oversight to operate ethically, we see echoes of the archer's ancient wisdom. That the most powerful technologies are those that amplify rather than replace human capability, that require rather than eliminate human skill, that enhance rather than diminish human agency and meaning. The digital age has not made the bow obsolete, but has revealed new contexts in which its fundamental principles remain relevant. As we continue to navigate the challenges and opportunities of technological advancement, we can still learn from the ancient archers' patient pursuit of mastery, their integration of mind and body in service of clear intention, and their understanding that true capability emerges from the marriage of human wisdom with properly designed tools. The song of the bowstring continues to echo through our silicon dreams, reminding us that no matter how sophisticated our technologies become, they will always require human skill, wisdom, and intention to achieve their highest potential. In every algorithm that serves human purposes, every interface that enhances human capability, every system that amplifies rather than replaces human intelligence, we hear the continuing music of that ancient partnership between human intention and technological possibility that first emerged in the caves of Africa 70,000 years ago. And so we come full circle, back to where our story began, in the flickering light of a fire, surrounded by the vast darkness of human possibility, listening to the whispers of our ancestors who learned to bend the world to their will through patience, skill, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The bow and arrow that emerged from the caves of Cebudu 70,000 years ago was more than just a weapon or a tool. It was proof of concept for human technological achievement, demonstration that intelligence applied systematically over time could transcend the apparent limitations of biology and physics. It was the first clear example of our species' extraordinary capacity to see possibility where others saw only constraint, to imagine solutions that did not yet exist, to transform the impossible into the inevitable through persistence and ingenuity. From that first bent stick and taut string emerged all the technologies that would follow: agriculture and metallurgy, architecture and engineering, computation and space flight. Each new innovation built upon the fundamental insights first discovered through archery, that natural forces could be harnessed rather than merely endured, that tools could extend human capability beyond its original boundaries, that patient practice could achieve results that seemed magical to those who had not done the work. The bow taught us about precision, about the relationship between intention and result, about the necessity of complete presence and focused attention. It showed us that true mastery requires not just technical knowledge but wisdom, not just practice but understanding, not just effort but harmony between human will and natural law. It demonstrated the power of accumulated knowledge, showing how insights passed from teacher to student, generation to generation, could build into capabilities that no individual could achieve alone. It proved that human civilization advances not through the genius of isolated individuals, but through the patient accumulation of small discoveries that build upon each other over vast spans of time. The bow also taught us about choice and consequence, about the double-edged nature of all powerful technologies. The same tool that could feed families could destroy enemies. The same skills that brought life could bring death. The same precision that could strike a target at impossible distances could be turned toward ends both noble and terrible. This duality reminds us that technological capability without wisdom is not progress but danger. That power without understanding leads to destruction rather than creation. The bow's legacy includes not just its positive contributions to human development, but also the sobering reminder that every increase in capability brings with it corresponding increases in responsibility. As we face our own technological challenges in the 21st century, artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, nanotechnology and biotechnology, space exploration and environmental restoration, we can draw wisdom from the 70,000-year journey of the bow and arrow. The same patterns of innovation that produced the first archer's success continue to operate today, and the same principles that guided ancient technological development remain relevant to our contemporary challenges. We must remember that the most important innovations are often the simplest ones, that transformative breakthroughs frequently emerge from patient refinement of existing capabilities rather than dramatic revolutions. We must understand that sustainable technological development requires thinking not just about immediate capabilities, but about long-term consequences and requirements. Most importantly, we must maintain the ancient archer's commitment to excellence, precision, and the systematic development of human capability. We must resist the temptation to seek shortcuts that bypass the patient work required for true mastery. We must remember that the most powerful technologies are those that enhance rather than replace human wisdom and judgment. In the end, the story of the bow and arrow is the story of human potential itself, the account of how our species learned to reach beyond its grasp, to achieve the seemingly impossible through intelligence, persistence, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations working together across time. Every time we face a new challenge, every time we work to master a new skill, every time we seek to extend our capabilities beyond their current limits, we are following the path first traced by that unknown archer in ancient Africa who looked at a bent stick and saw the future. The the song of the bowstring continues to echo through human consciousness, reminding us that we are not limited by the constraints we inherit, but empowered by the possibilities we can imagine and the dedication we bring to making those possibilities real. The fire burns low now, and the ancient voices grow quiet, but their wisdom remains. In every arrow that flies true to its target, in every tool that extends human capability, in every innovation that transforms the impossible into the everyday, we hear the continuing song of human ingenuity and determination. The bow and arrow taught us that we could be more than we were, that the future could be different from the past, that human intelligence and persistence could reshape the world itself. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were 70,000 years ago, when the first archer drew back the first bowstring and changed everything. Listen carefully, and you can still hear it. The whisper of string against wood, the song of possibility made manifest, the ancient music that taught our species how to reach beyond itself and grasp the stars. The story of the bow and arrow is complete, but the story it tells, of human potential unlimited by current constraints, of wisdom accumulated through patient practice, of the power of simple tools to transform entire civilizations, that story continues to unfold with every choice we make, every challenge we face, every arrow we loose into the vast unknown of our collective future. In darkness and in light, in war and in peace, in struggle and in triumph, the ancient song continues, reminding us who we are and what we might yet become. If we have the courage to draw back the string of possibility and release our highest aspirations into the waiting world,